Thank you and good morning. Let me first thank the organizers for this kind invitation to come and present. It's my first time in Tallinn. It's pretty cold, I have to say. But so I also, when Mary, I think it was now a year ago when you came to the OECD, when we were talking about some work that we were doing on the future of GVCs, because we get a lot of questions from people that are policy delegates from different capitals that come and ask us what's going to happen with globalization, what's going to happen with global value chains. First thing I always say is to be honest, I don't know exactly. Because if I would know exactly, I wouldn't be standing here. I wouldn't work at the OECD. Probably I wouldn't work at all. So what I'm trying to do today is to give some insights from things that we see changing over the years and in which direction, and we're trying to also underpin it with some evidence that we have to see where does this globalization, where do these value chains might go on. Now, the current situation or recent years are quite different from a couple of years ago. Beginning of the 2000s, we really saw that trade was increasing very fast and faster than GDP. Foreign direct investment is a bit more flexible, is a bit more variable, but we really see that this trade was pushing the global economy and companies were revising their strategies and were putting everything in very long and very complex value chains where one production phase produced some inputs for the other production phase, and it was really a process of very lean, of very efficient production across borders. But then in 2007, 2008, the economic crisis, financial crisis, you will really see a dip in this economic globalization, and it took 2-3 years afterwards in order that it picked up again. But now the last 2-3 years, we see again that trade is stalling a bit, that globalization, that global value chains are consolidating more. And the question is then, what's going to happen over the next years? And then I'm not talking about the next 2 years, but more about 5 to 10 years ago, because at the same time, there are some what we call structural shifts at the horizon that might change this organization into these global value chains completely. And a lot has to do with digital technologies, and I will come back to that later. And a lot of people are also talking about peak trade. Basically, the idea there is look, you better get used to the idea that trade won't be growing anymore like it did the last 10, 20 years. And of course, a lot of macroeconomists are a bit scared by that, are posing a lot of questions by that, because we really saw that this internationalization, this globalization, that was really the fuel of the global economy during the last years. So what I will do today is, and that's referring to the study that we did on the future of GVCs, is in order to get some insights from what will be happening, first we're looking backwards. What were the main drivers, what were the main determinants that were driving this evolution of global value chains into these long, complex production processes that were dispersed across borders? So we're looking back, and we're saying will it be business as usual? And then I will say a couple of things about open trade and investment, but open, we have to put some serious question marks with that, especially as we see what's happening during the last years. Some communication technologies, and the thing also what we try to do in this study is really, there is a lot of talk about ICT technologies. For us, it's quite different between the C and the I. While communication technologies will further push these value chains, will further push globalization, information technology might push the global economy into a different direction, because it really may become beneficial to keep activities much more at home because of the benefits or the advantages that digital technologies may create. Of course, new low-cost manufacturers, emerging middle class, as the previous speaker already said, that's more or less what we were talking about the last 10, 20 years, services, multinational enterprise. But at the other side, there are some factors that might argue for a new normal. Well, this is the whole idea of this peak trade. And then we're talking about changing cost conditions in emerging economies, different strategies of companies, again, information technologies, etc., etc. So I'm not going to discuss all of these different factors into detail today because that would take us a bit too long. But just bear with me, and I will try to highlight a couple of the things. So if you're looking at the two main factors in the past that were really pushing this global value change was one, the open global environment, open trade and investment, and at the other side, communication technologies that made that companies that it would be cost efficient to really spread out their activities across different borders. Now, if you're looking at this open trade and investment regime, well, the last years you see it's changing. There are still bilateral and regional investment and trade agreement signs, but the rhythm, the number of these agreements that are signed is going down. You really see that there is a lot of talk about protectionism, that there is a lot of talk from make our country great again, and that goes basically against this whole discussion of open trade and investment. And especially, as I said already, there is a really push towards protectionism. If you also see the G20 economies, and really G20 economies, or at least some of them, are really the proponents of open trade and investment, well, you really see that there are the last years that quite some restrictive measures have been put in place by these G20 economies. The second important factor are communication technologies, and there we really think that it will be business as usual. Digitalization is gaining speed, will give rise to a lot of new communication technologies. At the left side, we see some communication technologies that allowed companies to develop much more internationally. And you see that broadband, websites, social media, a lot of, or most of the companies are already using that. But there are still some technologies that are there already, but haven't been adopted, not yet that much by commercial companies. We're talking here about cloud computing. It's only the bigger firms that are really taking up that. Small and medium-sized enterprises are not really picking that up or have not really adopted these technologies. Supply chain management, big data is becoming important. And then the last thing is radio frequency identification technologies. I'm not an expert at all in it, but basically what they allow is that products that are moved and inputs as well as final product that are moved along these value chains, that they can be followed in real time. So basically that will allow a much more smoother and a much more efficient organization of production across borders. Another factor is the growing middle class, and especially in emerging economies. If you see there, for the moment, 50 to 60% of the middle class is really concentrated within developed economies, European Union, United States, Japan, and some other countries. But what you see over the next 20 to 30 years, you really see that this emerging middle class, especially in China and especially in India, will gain pace, and that a lot of the middle class will become concentrated within these two countries. And what you will see also is that consumption patterns will change within these countries, where richer people can spend more on technological products, on luxury products, etc., etc. So you will really see the global markets gradually shifting also towards these countries. And then the question is, will production follow? Will production stay a lot within, let's say, OECD economies, within developed economies, or will production also shift to these countries in order to be closer to the market? And I will come back to that later. I'm not going to say a lot about a lot of the new low-cost manufacturers. We know The last 5 to 10 years, China has taken an important place in global production. And we also know that, a bit blinded by this strong performance of China, a lot of countries are looking to these global value chains in order to pick up their place, in order to position their place within this international production landscape. Last point, and that's the most recent research that we are doing, a lot of these value chains are organized around multinational enterprises, and these multinational enterprises have become important. Basically, multinational enterprise, and a multinational enterprise is just a company that has at least one affiliate or an establishment in another country. Well, basically, if you're looking at their importance in the global economy, more than 50% of global trade is done by multinational enterprises. Within production and within GDP, it's a bit lower, it's about 1/3. And that's because there is a lot of double counting within these international export and import figures. In employment, it's even a bit lower, and the reason is that these multinational companies are much bigger, much more capital intensive, which means also much more labor productive. But interestingly, on this slide is also, there is a lot of discussion within this value chain about offshoring of jobs and employment to other countries. But basically what you see here, that for each job that a multinational is creating abroad, still 2 jobs are created within the home economy. So this whole discussion about offshoring of employment, offshoring of jobs, you really have to put that a bit into perspective. So that was what we call the business as usual scenario. If these factors will materialize, we can expect, okay, now this economic globalization is a bit lower, but then we can expect that gradually this will pick up again and will resemble more or less of the past. Let's now look at a couple of the determinants or these driving factors that might really push for a complete different scenario, for a real new normal within global economies. The one factor is really that, and I was reflecting earlier about the importance of China that has become a real global producer, and part of it was due to its low cost advantage. Now, what you see, and that's a bit the victim of being successful, is really that you see that these cost conditions in emerging economies, in some emerging economies at least, are changing rapidly. China is here, the middle one there, the dotted and the dashed line. You really see that wage costs in China, at least in Eastern China, because China is so big, but at least in Eastern China, you really see that these wage costs are increasing very rapidly, just like in some other economies. So, of course, if this cost advantage is become less outspoken, a lot of companies will reconsider their global organization and production structure. Now, at the same time, you have to be a bit careful with these type of deductions, of these type of conclusions, because increasing wage costs are most of the time reflected in growing productivity levels. So what you will see here, that is, yes, in Eastern China, wage costs or salaries are quickly increasing, but at the same time you will also see that labor productivity at least, is quickly increasing, which of course compensates a bit for these rising wage costs, and which would make this new normal factor of growing wage costs a bit more weak. Another thing, I don't have a slide about that, is that companies are really reconfiguring their global value chains. Because what you see, and that's especially with American companies, there was basically a bit of an overshooting of global value chains, and especially of offshoring. A lot of American companies have experienced that there are quite some hidden costs at offshoring activities, that they really didn't take into account all the costs that are included in that. And so you really see that companies are reconfiguring from, was it such a good idea to go that far? Because if in the US, a lot of companies were offshoring to China and other Asian economies, and there is really some reconfiguring, some reconsideration of these strategies. Another thing is that given that these global value chains are so efficient and are so lean, the problem is also that if something happens somewhere in the value chain, it has very quickly global effects. And you saw that, I think it was in 2011 with the earthquake and the tsunami in the northern eastern part of Japan, where you really see that, which was very, if you look at it from a global level, of course, which was very concentrated, but that shock had very rapidly global effects across the whole global economy. And where you really see that some producers that were, literally speaking, were wiped out, all the next steps in the production chains had also come to a standstill and had to stop production. So you really see that companies, instead of just in time, which has been an important factor in devising global value chains, that a lot of companies are now saying, what if, that they're bringing some alternative scenarios and that they're trying to bring in some different scenarios in order to see what would happen if something seriously would happen within these value chains. Another factor, and I referred already earlier to that, is really information technologies. We're doing at the OECD, we're bringing out a study early next year, is really that this digital revolution or digital evolution might quickly change the whole global economies. At the bottom, big data, cloud computing, and the Internet of Things, that for us are basically the building blocks, and that give rise to different technologies like artificial intelligence, additive and 3D manufacturing. So that could completely change the global economy. And one thing is really robots, automated machine that can completely, and we did some study, and I will refer to that in a minute, is really that can change the whole processes of offshoring and giving rise to reshoring and backshoring. These are some data about the robot stock among the top 10 using economies, and what you see is that there are heavy investments in this technology. Not only in OECD economies, not only in developed economies, but if you're looking what's happening in China, because of course China has also a lot to lose. And so China is also trying to take some advance, to really prepare itself for these changes in the global economy. Another thing, what is digital economies, digital technologies like robots, but also 3D printing, for example, allow, is that there is this organization in these long and these complex value chains has basically made a disconnection between production at the one side and consumption at the other side. And a company really wasn't able to respond very quickly to changes in consumer preferences. Why? Because these value chains, the whole production was organized in these long chains, which typically takes quite a number of days or even weeks in order that the product that's produced at the other end of the world can be sold, can be put in the shops, in the stores for consumers. So you really see that there was some disconnect between the market at the one side and the place of production at the other side. Now, digital economies gradually have allowed that what we are calling that there is a shift from mass production to mass customization. If you're looking, for example, at the new factory of Adidas in Germany, Adidas, who has brought quite some of its production of sports shoes back from Asia to Germany. Germany, a high salary, a high wage cost economy, and that's typically because of these digital economies. And that has also allowed that basically you can order your shoe different types of colors, different types of forms, through the internet, through their website, and within less than a week, the shoe will be produced and will be delivered at your home. So there is really this push towards this mass customization. Now, what we did in a study, I think it was in 2017 or 2017, is that we tried to, it's very nice to talk about these different trends, but how can you come up with some data? And so what we developed also at the OECD were some foresight scenarios specifically on value chains. And so we took a number of these factors, calculated them through with our general equilibrium model, which basically allows to take everything into account. What happens in one country has an effect on what's happening in the other countries. And we tried to look really, and I'm not going to go into detail in that. In a minute, I will tell you the main important observations of this. But basically, we tried to look at, okay, what will, if these scenarios, and the timeline of these scenarios was really 2030. So we were looking at 10 to 15 years in advance. And so we were trying to see, okay, what would happen with trade, global trade? What would happen with these global value chains? And for that, we were looking at offshoring, international sourcing, etc. We were looking how these value chains were structured, where we were looking at the geography of global value chains. Will it be Asia? Will it be Europe? Will it be Northern America? Etc., etc. And the last thing was that we were really, what would this mean in terms of where are the products and the services produced, and where is the value added created? Because, you know, in this global value chains discussion, you have a lot of debate about, okay, it's not that important where it's produced, is how that you're capturing the value added. So that were the different things that we were looking at into these different scenarios. Now, I'm going to focus now only on the combined scenarios where we put all the factors together. And what came out of there very clear is that digitalization, and then especially the I of ICT, the information technology, would act as a real game changer, because that would allow that domestic sourcing becomes much more beneficial, which means that offshoring would decrease over time. Trade is still increasing, but trade relative to GDP is taking a dip. And again, for macroeconomic people, that's very important, because that is a complete break of the past. And that there is really a rebalancing of the world economy. Now we saw the last 10 years this clear shift going to southeast direction, going to Asia. Well, you really see that there is some rebalancing going on towards OECD economies again. Why? Because it becomes beneficial again to produce within OECD economies. And so the conclusion of this is really that a new normal might imply, or a new normal might be at the horizon. We find that there might be a structural contraction of GVCs back to the level of 2005, 2006. I refer to the slide that I opened this presentation, which is quite important. If you're looking in absolute amount, maybe in percentages, it's not that much, but in absolute amounts, in US dollars, for example, it's very, very significant. So with international sourcing going down and trade GDP, as I told you already, would really take a dip. Now the question is, these foresight scenarios are all well, but do we have already some real-time indications? And so the next 2 to 3 slides, I will really point to some recent evidence that we have. This is evidence. Basically, I'm not allowed to show this, not yet, because there is an embargo on. This is evidence coming out of our new, what we call TIVA database, Trade in Value Added database, which will be released in 2 weeks' time at the 6th of December. And where you really see, so the indicator that is presented here is basically international sourcing, foreign value added in global exports, and where you really see that since 2011, 2012, not for most of the countries, because there are some differences across countries, but for most of the global regions, the world regions, you really see that the international sourcing is going down. And you really see this trend. Here are data for 2015. We have now some nowcasting data also for 2016. You really see that this new normal is apparently taking place. Now I'm seeing a lot of people taking pictures. Please be careful. As I said, I'm not allowed. In principle, I'm not allowed, but I just want to give you some sense of new evidence that we're producing within the OECD. Another thing is that we did some analysis specifically, again, and I'm coming back to this thing about the robots, and we really tried to look from, do these investments in robots, do they have some effect on where production is located, on the global organization of production? And basically, what we found is that there is a clear negative link between, at the one side, investment in robots, and at the other side, offshoring. So in countries and industries where there is a lot of investment in these robots, you really see that offshoring of production is going down. Now, a couple of caveats. It's only in the most recent years. Why? Because these investments in robots are taking place in these most recent years. We only find some evidence for developed economies. So the investments in China, we don't see an effect, not yet. And it's interestingly, we see quite some effect specifically in labor-intensive industries. I was referring already to the example of Adidas before, because this is in the footwear industry typically that has been offshored to low-cost countries, has come back. Another example is the Philips factory in the north of the Netherlands, close to Groningen, where they have also brought their production of shavers, electrical shavers. Basically, Philips brought that back or half of their production, brought it back to a big factory, completely automated, with a lot of robots. I think there are working 150 people, but they are basically producing half of their sales within this factory within the Netherlands. When we did this study last year, we didn't find a lot of evidence for backshoring, because there is a bit of a difference. At one side, you can look at offshoring. Our companies are still are offshoring their production to other countries. But now, recently, there is a lot of discussion about reshoring, backshoring, especially in the US. This is an important point of debate. We didn't find anything we didn't find any result on that. It was not that we found that if you're investing a lot of your investments in robotics, that allowed to bring your production back for these low-cost economies. I gave you the examples of Philips and Adidas. Well, apparently, this was not a general conclusion. These were only examples of a couple of companies. But most recently, and we did the analysis a couple of weeks again, and now we also see that an effect on backshoring. So we really see that these robots, these information technologies, allow companies not to offshore anymore, and actually also bringing activities back towards developed economies. And of course, if these trends persist, and we think that they will go on for the next couple of years, this will really have a negative effect on global value chains. So just let me conclude with some tentative, and I say again, I'm not exactly knowing what will happen with these value chains, but just let me conclude. We think that in the past there was definitely some overshooting of these value chains. Have been increasing very fast, and probably some companies really came to the conclusion now from, look, we've gone too far it's not that beneficial anymore to keep our production there. At the same time, we have a very uncertain global environment, but let me say that can change quickly. Trade tensions typically bump up very quickly, but in some instances they have disappeared also very clearly. So, but at the same time, there is, at the longer term, we really think this digitalization, these information technologies will structurally change the global economy, will structurally change the organization of these global value chains. And we really see that some companies already picking up on that, are already answering on that, and that is according to us that there might be quite some effect on this international organization of production. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So are there any questions in the room? Anybody would like to ask a question? If you're still thinking about it, let me ask a first question then. If you look at the current policy debates on international trade, they seem to be relatively sort of simplistic, if not misleading, particularly in the era of Trump. So we often focus on balance of trade in sort of categories of goods or between specific countries. And I'm wondering, what can we do that this sort of value-added based view, the view of the global value chains, would be more sort of important in the policy debates about trade? Is there anything we can do, if at all? Thank you.
Well, I would say knock on the doors of your ministers with this evidence. That's also what we're trying to do. And we see that in some countries, the policy discussion is really changing. Mm-hmm. That it's moving away from these trade balances, et cetera, but in some countries and with some new leaders, political leaders, we don't get access, we don't get an entry. They have their ideas, and it's very difficult to change the views in these countries. We are trying to do quite some, how should I say, lobbying. We're trying to do quite some advising to these political leaders, but they're so blinded. And that's the danger. They're so blinded by what's happening within their home country. Mm-hmm. Of course, this whole discussion about offshoring, it's a lot of jobs, it's a lot of employment, but at the same time, you see, if you dig a bit deeper within the data, you actually see that offshoring of production and offshoring of jobs still has also quite some positive effects on your employment at home. So what we're trying to do from the OECD side on is trying to bring up some new evidence, trying to knock on the doors from, hey, watch out, try to have a bit more global and more comprehensive view. I guess that's the only thing what we can do for the moment.
All right, thanks. Any other questions? Yeah, there is a question there. Could you wait for a mic? So she's going to bring you a mic.
Thank you for a very interesting overview. I was wondering, you mentioned this change of offshoring, that if this new very robotized or automized investments, they likely will be done in home country than in this cheap production countries. Isn't the pattern the same that it was previously when some industry had a quite heavy dispute inside if this very intensive units should be at all transferred to these other countries where the production is cheap, because the question of servicing of this very state-of-art production lines are almost or often not very possible, or this ability to help this industry if there is any kind of breaks. Mm-hmm. Isn't the same pattern? Thank you.
It's a good point. It's the same pattern in the sense that basically what companies and developed countries were doing before is in order to withhold the production in order to keep the production at home is really to make their production process more capital intensive. And a lot of new technologies were then brought in, and we know that in a more capital intensive production process, the ratio or the importance of your labor costs is not that important, and that allows you to keep the things at home. The fact that you also put some new technologies in is also keeping production here in developed economies, while because you don't want to offshore your most efficient technology, because you know that in some of these low labor cost economies, protection of intellectual property right is not that important. I think now it's similar, but I think now it's really this information technologies, these digital technologies that are changing the picture. And I think while before it was more gradually, I think now it really can make a complete change and a complete break if companies are really starting to invest within these information technologies, within these robots, and that you really see that there will be a point from where companies will say we're not going to offshore anymore, we're not going to push it aside anymore, but really trying to bring some activities back also. So yes, it's similar, but at the same time, I think the effects might be much bigger and much more beneficial for developed economies.
All right. Thank you very much. So the time is up. We have to finish. I'm sorry. But thanks for coming. And here is a small present for you.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you.